You're listening to Masonry Principles, your guide to building better buildings, with hosts Amanda Bedian and Phil Leden. Thanks for listening to Masonry Principles. Today we've got Amy Baker of Amy Baker Architecture out of Michigan, who was recommended through Lydell and Hart, a masonry contractor out of Michigan as well. And we figured we'd have just a candid conversation about some of the work she's done, constructability, and some of her favorite projects that have included masonry. So thank you for being here, Amy.
Thank you for inviting me to the program. I'm excited to participate.
Fantastic. And we've got Phil here. So, as far as architecture, can you just give us a little bit of your masonry history and the projects you've dealt with in regards to it?
Sure. So my experience over the last 18 or so years has mostly been working for large architectural offices. And within those offices, I was very often working on structures that were either cavity wall construction or load-bearing masonry construction. So kind of assembling documentation that describes that kind of construction has literally been kind of in my bag of tricks for many years. So I grew to comfort level with laying out drawings that were sort of more masonry based, and even some veneer projects where the backup is steel. Just kind of knowing how different materials kind of interface with each other and what happens when we change the backup structure. And it's just kind of always been something that's grown along the way, and it became really familiar to me. So more recently, about 3.5 years ago, I decided to go into independent practice. So now, as a firm owner, I often look to masonry solutions when I get to sort of influence and help a team decide what kind of structure or veneer might be appropriate for like an addition or new construction. So I'm really excited to be able to kind of carry that forward in my own practice.
Well, congratulations on going independent 3.5 years ago. That must be its own little journey.
Yeah, it's been busy right from the start. Like, I'm thrilled to be able to say that I haven't really had any times during this last 3.5 years where I've been sort of sitting around thinking like, oh gosh, what am I going to do next? I'm really lucky, and I think that my network of contacts has really played into that, including a lot of folks that are in the masonry industry as well. So it's just a background that is really special to me.
Absolutely. Are there any tools that you'd like to share that you use when designing with masonry, whether it's something like a program or a reference guide that you use?
From a program standpoint, I am still kind of a dinosaur in independent practice, meaning I'm still using AutoCAD, which is kind of a 2D stupid set of drawings. So I had to learn how to do drawings when I started practicing in AutoCAD because Revit wasn't really a thing or widely adopted at that point. And that's what I'm still using. So I'm sort of happy for that experience though, because when you're thinking about things in 2D first, you're having to plan modules and spacing and dimensions very intentionally as it relates to modules that apply to common masonry materials. So those kinds of tools and experiences are really familiar because I have to do it and I have been doing it in 2D. More recently, I've been learning and hopefully getting better at using programs like Revit where we're actually generating models. And while I'm using some of the same kinds of like background that I'm pulling from to sort of lay out a building properly that's going to be constructed of masonry materials, I do think that like for someone that's never had to do it, in 2 dimensions. Like they may not be thinking of the modules in the same way that maybe I'm just more accustomed to doing it. It's really easy to kind of model something and then realize, oh my gosh, it looks like a building. There's walls, there's windows, there's doors, and like it looks like a building in this sort of 3D world. So it must mean that that's okay. But when it comes to masonry design, there's a lot of nuance in how it's laid out, and I find that we have to kind of build this sort of model and then go back to it and make sure that all of these dimensions are kind of refined. So I think it's sort of like a different approach to solving the same problem.
Yeah, I actually wanted to touch on that real quick, Amy. So I think one of the problems I see, at least in reviewing all the drawings that do come through the Masonry Institute, is not a lot of architects or engineers, for that matter, really think with modularity in mind. And so I definitely wanted to applaud you for that. And I mean, it's so critical to constructability, and especially with OSHA, cracking down on airborne silica, things like that. Plus, just the time element of cutting units. I mean, I think there's a Walgreens down the street from my house that not a single opening is in coursing, and so I mean, should have invested in saw blades before that got built or something. But I mean, how can we, I guess, as an industry, either on the architectural side or through promotional groups like MIM or the Upstate Masonry Institute, how can we get that word out there, help kind of force people to think in modularity? Because I mean, it's a real prevalent problem that we see all the time.
I was actually curious if this was going to come up because in my mind, it's like at the front of my mind when I lay out a masonry building to stay on coursing as much as humanly possible. And of course, like there's going to be variations on that. We don't make buildings that are just perfect squares all of the time, and there's a lot of things that happen that really you can't stay on coursing forever. But to the largest extent possible, I'm trying to do that when I'm laying things out. And I think back to when I started detailing masonry structures, and really who clued me into that were the sort of quality control reviewers within the big firm I was working for, and the senior architects that were checking and marking up my drawings. And after I got familiar with what they were actually asking me to do, then I just started doing it, right? And learning why that was important. And it can be as simple as like a single life load bearing wall where, staying on coursing is fairly straightforward. But when we get into some of these more complicated veneer systems where we're switching out a brick unit with maybe a limestone band element or a cast stone band where it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to a module, but like for constructability reasons, we kind of want it to be forced into that module somewhat so it doesn't throw off the coursing everywhere else, right? So I think that just sort of learning that and practicing it over and over and over again made a huge difference in my own personal experience. And when I was working for larger firms, that was the kind of message I was trying to send to people that were maybe doing that kind of detailing for the first time when I was marking up the drawings. So I do think that a lot of that responsibility falls on the shoulders of the senior architects within the firms. But, I don't know that everybody necessarily realizes that because maybe masonry is not their primary focus when they typically design whatever it is they're designing. So I think that there's probably a lot of variability, and I'm interested that you have experienced that sort of as a outsider looking in, right, to the various sets of drawings that you've probably seen.
With the Masonry Society, which I do chair, I mean, we do advocate for Masonry IQ, which we do have a podcast episode on, which kind of helps architects that work kind of in that Revit realm to know where cuts are being made, but we don't see widespread use of that software yet. I do think, we're trending in a positive direction. And I think as we get more accurate with our modeling in Revit and move towards like a BIM workspace, I think that'll definitely kind of force that issue. But I guess I mean I think from where I'm sitting at MIM, I think we really need to do a better job of kind of educating the educators. Yet I say that because I do teach at the University of Toledo, and I happened to be walking by a classroom one day, and they were telling these students to place control joints at 150 feet apart in a block wall, and it was just a matter of it was actually published in a book that was required for the course. But I mean, the teacher didn't have a lot of background in masonry. The book obviously had a mistake in it. But it's like, I mean, how many issues is that one statement going to cause? And I think it really, if we want to impact a larger change, especially in architectural programs, You think about like your U of M's, LTUs, where we're generating just a lot of students. I think it kind of needs to start there. And so I'm kind of curious, when you went through school, did they focus on masonry number one? And I guess did they get into constructability and coursing, modularity, those kind of things number two?
No, they did not. So the short answer is no. I think that like at the university level, the courses where we're talking about detailing to the sort of level that we're talking about right now, that doesn't usually occur. I think we're talking about masonry more as a generality. There are buildings made of masonry, and here's some pros and cons for using it, and maybe that's kind of the extent of the coursework at a university level. All of the more detailed design things that I learned in practice were happening within my office. And the other thing I wanted to add to that too is that the office where I gained this early experience had internal structural engineering services. So we had engineers sitting next to architects and designers like myself at the time. And I realized that I learned a lot more by looking at the engineering drawings than I did the architectural details in some cases. Because when you're just starting out, you're often trying to find examples of what's been done in that office before. And I mean, for good reason, there's an exactness to structural engineering drawings. So it's really easy as an architect to kind of draw two lines and hatch in between with a masonry pattern and call it a brick or a block wall, which I do think happens a lot. But it's another thing to start talking to a structural engineer about what's actually happening and the importance of sort of preserving a masonry core so that it can be reinforced with vertical rebar, and understanding that if you chop that block in the wrong place, you may have compromised an opportunity to reinforce it where it needs to be reinforced. So I think that there's a lot to be learned for architects in studying structural detailing of masonry. And that obviously applies to the load bearing part, but also to an extent the veneer systems too. We're following a lot of the same rules, and then we're also having to deal with like how to support that veneer, which is another structural question. And a lot of times that introduces steel, right, in the form of steel lintels and things like that. So I tended to realize that I was going to be better off looking at structural details when setting up my own architectural details than sort of using the architectural details within the office. So I kind of switched gears and decided to learn how to detail it, maybe more consistent with what the engineers were drawing.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I think, I mean, part of what we've seen too, and I don't know if it necessarily came out of COVID or it was just a trend in the industry anyways, but it seems like a lot of the senior level staff we work at with architecture and engineering firms around the state, the average age is trending down. And so I know you had the benefit of having a lot of engineers and architects kind of that brought all that experience to the table, and having architects and engineers in the same office, I think is a tremendous asset. I mean, both at Bergman and at Fishbeck, where I worked, those were full AE companies, and there was a lot of value I saw from that as well. But I mean, for younger people kind of moving upwards in a company, if they don't have necessarily the experience with these materials, it creates a bad situation for masonry where they didn't really learn about it in school necessarily. They might not have experience in it in their own company. And so a lot of this stuff is kind of an unknown. Yeah, and I think that's a lot of what we're struggling with right now.
Amanda asked about any reference guides or tools. So I think I did start way back when somebody gave me a chart, a paper chart that had it probably came from Architectural Graphic Standards or some reference book like that, but it had like a chart that had masonry coursing on it and then all of the corresponding dimensions. And that thing kind of blew my mind because then I realized like I should probably stick to these and probably not kind of cut an opening that doesn't fall in line with these dimensions in some form. And then another architect shared with me like a quick and easy check for coursing that I still use to this day. And at the time I was thinking, oh, I'm just too inexperienced and everybody knows this trick. And I've shared the same trick with others, both people early in their career and also some veterans. And I've been surprised to find out that not everybody realizes a quick sort of coursing trick. And that being that, like, if you're dealing with standard unit masonry dimensions, meaning some factor of 8 inches, right, is typically kind of where we're at with that. If you're looking at the building in feet and inches, which here we often are, if the foot number is even, then the inch number is either 0 or 8 if you're staying within coursing. And if the foot number is odd, then the inch number is 4. So like 5'4", 6 foot, 6'8", and so on and so on. So I ended up not actually using that paper chart as much after somebody told me that, because it's an easy way to always know if you're putting your openings or showing dimensions that are in coursing.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that was probably the most valuable thing that somebody just randomly told me one day. And it still surprises me that people don't know that. It's not as common as I thought. I realized that may be the case when I saw people like busting out their calculator and trying to do foot and inches, to make sure that they were in coursing. But that's a really important trick. I think that should be widely shared. And it's such an easy one, too. I'm not sure why it's not as widely shared as what I was thinking.
Yeah, I think it's a great trick and one that I honestly didn't even know about. I mean, I'm an engineer, and so I just think in decimals, and so I think in 0.33s and
Yeah.
0.667. So I just do the math in my head, but that's a really good, valuable trick that I think maybe we'll just record a little segment on our YouTube page or something. Because I was completely unaware that even existed.
I'm sort of relieved to hear you say that. Like, it's so easy when you look at a string of dimensions. It's just so easy to identify something that falls off of coursing and then make a decision if you need to bring it back into coursing or, for whatever reason, leave it the way it is. You can sort of instantly look at a whole drawing's worth of dimensions and know if the building is in coursing or not with that trick without having to think about it, do math in your head. There's no math involved. So I love the trick. I've been sharing it for years and years and years, and I hope that it helps other people as well.
Oh, I know, and it'll help all the listeners of this podcast definitely, and I think we'll probably push it out more beyond that. So yeah, that was really helpful. The other thing I wanted to touch on too, I mean, you talked about in school how they kind of talked about masonry where it fit in, where it didn't fit in. And obviously, I mean, it's no secret that we are kind of at odds with the wood industry right now. And as we look at kind of a lot of the buildings being constructed, I live in Lansing, but I'm in Detroit quite frequently. And we see a lot of podium style
Mm-hmm.
construction, a lot of light frame style construction, and our I codes are moving towards taller and taller wood frame buildings. I mean, is that something that's kind of instilled in school? I mean, what was a typical masonry job when you were in school? What did they tell you that was?
I think in architectural programs, we're not really talking a lot about why structural or veneer systems are selected necessarily. I think that it's more introductory, like, here's the types of materials that people construct buildings out of versus you should do this for this reason and this for that reason. I mean, certainly, I think at a university level, we could do more to kind of like educate students in not only the material options for buildings, but also the applications and why masonry as a building material is better at doing certain things than maybe other materials, right?
Sure.
I think that there's maybe another level that a lot of programs could cover where we're not really hitting that mark just yet. But I will say, from someone that kind of came through a more technical program to begin with, I went to Lawrence Tech. So I think that they're sort of known to be a program that's very agreeable with people that want to be practitioners. I did feel like I got a pretty good technical background attending Lawrence Tech. And I do remember certain lectures where we were talking about masonry or spec writing or certain other building materials. We would have kind of like a lunch and learn, is kind of what it was. I remember those classes a lot. And those were the kinds of classes that I was most interested in. And I remember thinking, wow, this is like the real stuff. This is real materials here we're talking about. Like, people build with them. they're able to be purchased and installed. Like, that's the stuff that really blew my mind as a student compared to some of the more design focused studios where we're just talking about like volumes and forms and experiences and light, and all of those things are important too. And that's all part of being an architect and learning how to design buildings is kind of factoring all of those things in. But I will say, I think that a lot of programs are missing the mark in not preparing students to deal with real building materials. My alma mater, I think, did a decent job of introducing it because I remember those lectures pretty vividly. But I think that we could do more at the university level just to prepare people. Like when you land in a firm after graduating, you go from like conceptualizing design to actually detailing buildings. And that's a pretty huge ask of somebody that's never really thought about building materials before. So I think that preparing students for what they're going to have to do, assuming they're going to enter the profession and start practicing architecture in a more traditional way, I think that we can definitely do better to kind of prepare them for that.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, this Friday, I do sit on the advisory board at Lawrence Tech because that's where I went as well. And they have an architectural engineering program that I think even does, yeah, I think the architecture program's great. They definitely prepare people for kind of workforce. But the architectural engineering program, I'm really excited about the students that come out of there because they actually do mechanical, electrical, structural, and architectural. I think it's a 5-year program, but then they can either go into the architectural career path and get their AIA certification, or they could, be a licensed PE as well, depending on kind of where they see that they want to take their career. But it's nice because they kind of bring that knowledge of everything else to the table. Where, when I practice engineering, I mean, a lot of younger engineers don't think about ductwork, right? I mean, they
Right.
don't learn about ductwork in school. They don't think about distribution and things like that. And so it's kind of nice that Lawrence Tech and some other programs around the country are kind of making it more of a collective knowledge base of just design in general for buildings. So I'm really happy with that as well. Amanda, is there anything you wanted to ask?
Just curious as far as, I mean, with all the projects you've worked on in your career, was there one project that pops out that made you appreciate the masonry material a little bit more or made it become a preferred material to work with?
I mean, my most sort of fulfilling masonry project, I would definitely say, is having the opportunity to work on the enclosure of Little Caesars Arena, which is largely a masonry veneer building. And what was neat about it to me is that it's technically a high rise, right? So we have things like shelf angles and structure to support this veneer at intermediate levels. And we had a bunch of different masonry materials. There was like granite base, there's a brick veneer, there's cast stone, there's, gosh, I'm forgetting some, but like we're mixing and matching a whole bunch of different masonry materials. And then, just coordinating the support systems that held up that veneer was quite a big undertaking. And it took a lot of coordination with the steel contractor who's working from different tolerances than a mason typically is. So when we went through the design process of that project and understanding like this masonry building has a lot of different architectural points of interest around the entire facade. So even though it's mostly a masonry structure, the veneer character changes 16 times around the building because it's not meant to look like a big, massive building. It's meant to have sort of smaller scale moments that are more relatable from the street. It's supposed to look like a streetscape. It's sort of like detailing 16 masonry buildings in one. And because it was a pretty complicated veneer project, we did end up working directly with Lydell and Hart on the review side when we were probably about 50% done coming up with the detailing and the wall sections for the structure, along with the Masonry Institute of Michigan. We had a sit down meeting, and I remember having a whole series of questions for the group about this is how I'm showing this detail. What do you think of the constructability of it? So we had really good and helpful discussions about water management, drainage, flashing, drip edges, weeping materials, and kind of all of the pieces and parts. And we kind of just critiqued the details in a pinup session. And the results of that discussion got updated in the set of drawings, and we sort of carried it through to complete the construction of the arena. It was just a really great process, and being able to engage the contractors who would eventually be awarded the project early on and kind of give them an opportunity to shoot holes in it was a really valuable exercise. And while it was under construction, I got to visit the job site. I was the architect working on the CA side. So I was there every week in the trailer with the mason contractors and the other subcontractors and the CM. And I got to hear firsthand how things were going along the way. Like, hey, how did that detail work out? Hey, did you have any questions on this weird drip edge detail that we're showing? And we got to work on refining it even further during construction through the mock-ups, through the actual builds. And I think a lot of great things happened as a result of that process on that project. And I feel like the results of all of that effort turned out really well. So that's for sure my favorite project.
And I wanted to ask a quick question about that because we actually just wrote an article. It'll be in our December newsletter through the MIM, but kind of talking about early design involvement from the industry. And it was on a hospital project in Alpena that Fishbeck and Three Rivers Corporation were involved with. And Lydell and Hart was also the contractor on that one. But they kind of got early involvement from the MIM, from Superior Precast and Belden Brick and Supply. And the project went amazing. I mean, there were very little, if any, RFIs on any of the veneer sections. And I really attribute it to kind of the designers at Fishback and Three Rivers kind of getting that early design involvement on projects. And I don't see that happening enough. And I just wanted to ask what your perspective was on that. I mean, I'm glad you did that at Little Caesars, and I was actually just at the game on Monday night, and it's an absolutely beautiful arena, a beautiful showcase of masonry. But I guess early design involvement, is that something that you see a lot of architects in the industry taking advantage of, or not? And how can we kind of promote that?
I think that it does not happen as often as I would like to see it happen because it ended up being such a valuable process. I would love to see it repeated on all projects if possible. The trick there is that the award of a masonry contract through a construction manager may not occur early enough in the design process in order for something like that to be possible. So if for some reason, the mason contractor is asked to participate in a design effort, they have to be engaged and know that they're going to get the work eventually, is my suspicion. And from a timing perspective, it can be a little bit tricky because you're sort of awarding a contract for a masonry structure that's not yet been designed. So I think that that's kind of a logistical area where I'm not sure what the answer is. But in this particular case, I think that enough things were in place for everyone to anticipate that mason contractor would be on the project. And also, what kind of facilitated that was the Masonry Institute of Michigan's involvement, meaning I reached out to the Masonry Institute for a drawing review during design, and they said, yep, we can help with that. We'll look at the details, we'll get together at a meeting. And also, would it be helpful to invite Lydell and Hart? And I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, that would be great. If we could have them there, knowing that there's a good chance that they're going to be building these details, I think that's a great idea. I owe that to the Masonry Institute of Michigan for facilitating that and kind of making the connection. And I would love to see more of that happen whenever it's feasible.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not going to give us too big of a shameless plug here at MIM, but I will say that, we do that with a lot of architects. And to your point about, kind of logistics with the award, given I've found that a lot of our contractors are more than happy to help, even if it means they aren't ultimately awarded the work, because it might mean there's more masonry in the market. And, if you think about it big picture, if there's more masonry in the market, there's more work for everyone, kind of a rising tide lifts all ships kind of mentality. And I think our members have been outstanding. Anytime, we ever need anything from any of our contractor members, whether it's, pricing or if we're trying to flip a job to masonry or detail review, things like that, they've all been great. And I think they all do a really good job of kind of looking at masonry as an industry, not as, an individual contractor. And I think that's our huge value. And so I definitely would encourage other architects to take advantage of those resources on projects. And if we can turn it load bearing, we're going to turn it load bearing. But if all we get to do is the veneer, then we'll help you with that as well. So yeah, I really appreciate all the time. I know we're coming up on the end here today, so I wanted to first thank you, Amy, so much for taking the time today. I think we've had a great relationship with you through the MIM, and I really appreciate all that you do for the industry and you taking the time today to jump on with Amanda and I. And I wanted to thank all of our listeners here at Masonry Principles, and have a great day.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is really fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Masonry Principles. To continue the conversation, be sure to reach out to us by visiting masonryprinciples.com.